welcome everybody to this webinar organized by the Fetisov Journalism Awards. This is the first in a new series of awards that of webinars that we're going to be organizing in the coming year. The purpose of our webinars is to promote and highlight the excellent quality journalism that has been produced by our winners. And not only to pay tribute once again to their achievement, but also to look at their journalism and to examine how important it is, not just for reinforcing good journalism and quality and ethics in our work, but also how journalism contributes to making the world a better place. And contributes to ensuring that the defense of democracy and human rights continues to be protected. We've got an absolute marvelous lineup for you today. It's also significant because this series of webinars, which we are going to be expanding during the year, comes on the 5th anniversary of the FJA. For 5 years now, the FJA has been paying tribute to journalists all around the world who are continuing in the most difficult conditions to produce groundbreaking journalism, which is really making a difference to people's lives. So after 5 years, we've got a rich resource of talent to draw upon. And what we're going to do today is we're going to reflect on the work of a couple of our winners and see how they contribute to helping us as journalists and news media to better understand one of the key issues that needs to be discussed these days when we're talking about building peace, ending conflict, and so on. And that is the role of women in our societies. So we've got joining us and who'll be making presentation, Camille, Maubert, and Hugh, Kinsella, Cunningham, who were winners this year in our section related to peace building. And they're coming to us direct from the Congo, and we're very delighted that they'll be able to join us. They'll be followed by Nidžara Ahmetašević from Bosnia, who last year received one of our major awards for an absolutely wonderful piece in the aftermath of the war and particularly the massacre in Srebrenica. And after she's made her presentation, we're going to hear from Ljiljana Zurovac from Serbia, who was for years the head of the Bosnian Press Council and has a fantastic record as a journalist and is well-known activist as well. And then after her, we're hoping that we will be joined by Raffaella Chiodo Karpinsky, member of our expert council, like Ljiljana, who is going to talk to us about the issues arising from these stories that we're talking about today. And last, but by no means least, we're going to hear from Azhgikhina, who is a member of the steering committee and one of the leadership team in the Fetisov Journalism Awards. And Nadia will add her thoughts. And her record as a warrior for women's rights and for gender equality, not just in Russia, but around the world, is so well known. And I'm delighted that she's going to be able to join us for that. Before we start, I just wanted to say a few words about this particular issue that we're going to look at. We're looking at the question of women as potentially as peacemakers in areas of conflict. It's really a critical issue because in most of today's wars, and unfortunately we see this in the Gaza conflict, civilian casualties, and particularly women and children, far outnumber those of armed combatants. Unarmed men and women and children suffer human rights violations, such as indiscriminate killings and torture. But women are subject to certain abuses more often than men. And that's what we're going to be having a look at, and in particular ways. Now, particularly women and girls are more likely to be the targets of sexual violence, especially rape. And women face extra, often insurmountable obstacles to seeking justice, very often because of the stigma that is attached to being survivors of sexual violence, and naturally because of women's disadvantaged position in society. Their role as carers, combined with higher levels of poverty, mean that the impact of war's destruction weighs particularly heavily on them. Now, I want to be clear about this. There are academic arguments about whether or not women are by nature peacemakers. That's not what we're going to debate today. We're not here to debate this because it's obvious that some women, like some men, may be bellicose and may be warlike. And in the same way, some men, like women, are dedicated peacemakers. But there is a challenge for us to deal with, and that challenge is what appears to be the invisibility of women very often when it comes to the question of peacemaking. 4 years ago, and I think it helps to be our starting point, 4 years ago, the United Nations passed a resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and this highlighted the very important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and peace building. And they called that resolution, that agenda calls for much more study and understanding of the impact of armed conflict on women and girls, but also the role of women in peace building and the gender dimensions of peace processes and conflict resolution. So this resolution promotes the grassroots voices of women. And it's through media that the grassroots voices of women can be heard on peace matters and, of course, on women's perspectives in general. So the journalism that we highlight today adds to the body of knowledge that is being gathered. And all of it suggests that we can build a better world and our quality of humanity will improve when women are empowered. And in order for that empowerment to take place, it's really essential that news media put them more in the picture when the stories are being produced. So it's with that thought in mind that we want to sort of focus on this particular question of the role of women in peacemaking. And our first speakers, I really am delighted to invite Camille Maubert and Hugh Kinsella Cunningham. And unfortunately, the third member of your team, Sifa Bahati, is not able to join us, and I'm sorry about that. But Camille, you are an award winner. You've been working in the Congo, which is one of the world's hotspots. It's absolutely, for decades now, been a center of conflict and so on. And the work that you've been doing as journalists has been absolutely remarkable. So can you take us through your story and perhaps talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you faced?
Yes, thank you, Aidan, for the great introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really amazing to be invited to this webinar and to be able to share some hopefully interesting and useful insights into the work that we've done about women and peace in Congo. So the story was published originally in National Geographic in 2022, then in The Guardian in 2023, and it's still a project that's ongoing at this time. What we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how the story emerged, what's the rationale behind it, and then Hugh will take over to speak about 4 specific pictures and how we made them. So when you look at the kind of journalistic stories and research that's being done in the Congo in the past decade or so, it's always about the conflict, and especially with regards to women and girls, they're always portrayed as the main victims of conflicts, victims of the worst forms of violence, like you described, Aidan, like rape, displacement, sexual slavery, etc. And all of those are true, of course. But when you start spending enough time in one place and talking to people, you come to realize that those stories are incomplete and provides, we found, a very disempowering view of women's realities in these conflict zones. So the story emerged when we started talking to women in local associations in Eastern Congo. And they told us about the kind of work that they've been doing for years and that Hugh will talk about a bit later. But they also said that somehow this worked when completely unnoticed. So we tried to do a story that captured that worked and that went against the mainstream narrative of the women as forever victims of conflicts. The point, of course, of the story is not to paint like a glowy, rosy picture of, women are superheroes, or because that's also not accurate, and it doesn't reflect the very difficult setting they live in. Some of the women activists that we've talked to said they face very often backlash as a result of their engagement for peace, be it in the forms of threats, harassment. Some of them were exiled, even death. So we try to strike that balance by, on one hand, acknowledging the reality of conflict and violence and the many, many obstacles that these women face, but also, on the other hand, finding moments of agency and of courage when they stand up for peace and fight for an end of violence in their communities. What we also tried doing in the project is to avoid framing it as us giving them a voice, giving a voice to women in Congo, because they already have a voice, and they're very loud and they're very courageous despite the patriarchal context in which they work. And we saw our role more as trying to capture that voice and to relay it as accurately as possible. And so in order to do this, for each of the women portraits, Hugh and Sifa, who's our Congolese colleague, spent hours, days, and repeated visits following these women, observing their work. And then I conducted hours and hours of interviews, the idea being not to just get a couple of quotes, but to really spend time and try to understand what their vision is, what the work is about, the contradictions, the challenges of their work, and to really try and do justice to what they're doing. So I'll stop here after this very brief overview, and then I will hand over to Hugh to talk about 4 of the pictures.
Hello. So for this project, let's have a look at this. This is a great photo to sort of start the discussion about what we were trying to achieve. So most of the most hectic moments in the project came from the M23 conflict. So there's multiple conflicts going on in Congo at the moment. The M23 is one of the most intense, one of the most violent. So M23 are a Rwandan proxy army operating in East Congo. And at the moment where we are, Goma, they've actually surrounded the city. But this was taken in mid-2022 when the fighting was still out in the countryside. And this was taken just after an M23 offensive to seize a few towns and villages, and lots of civilians had been displaced. So the lady you can see here raising her finger at this general in the middle is a lady called Liberata Buratwa. She's a fantastic person. She's been a peace activist for decades in this area called Rutshuru. And the other women you can see in this meeting are displaced civilians. So after going to greet civilians who had fled from the fighting, and inquire about the situation, see where they'd come from, where the fighting actually was, Liberata arranged a meeting with the general who's from the Congolese army, with several of these women, to tell him to consider the perspective of civilians in his operations, to make sure that weapons and army units are not operating too close to displacement camps, etc. And very few people in this context have the social status necessary to sort of approach a general, senior military commanders like this, and that's a very rare moment where civilians are able to directly interact with the military and share their concerns, be kept in the forefront. And, Liberator is always a fantastic advocate for the rights of civilians. In the previous round of the conflict with the CNDP rebels about 15, 20 years ago, before they became the M23, Liberator arranged a ceasefire. Her and a delegation of women crossed the front line and arranged a ceasefire. And this is also, as a photographer, this is the kind of stuff that happens in a split second after years of, making the connections and looking for the right bits of access. These kind of photos are incredibly rare to have. But again, it's so important for us not just to have portraits of these people, to spend the time getting the reportage access to actually see what we're talking about, because it's very easy with this type of work to reduce it to sort of tokenistic, feel-good phrases and stuff. This is actually about people directly interacting with soldiers and senior commanders. So in the work as well, it was very important for me to include images from the military side of the context as well. Because this work doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a feel-good story. We need to see in this kind of work just how close the fighting in the front lines are to civilians. So in this, you can see a Congolese military tank unit heading off to fight an advancing M23 unit just north of the city of Goma, just about 5 kilometers north of here this was. And you can see civilian taxi drivers, motorcycle taxi drivers, driving alongside the column, lost in the passion of the moment, cheering on their soldiers. Again, so this kind of work, to show the work of the women, it was absolutely essential to show exactly what's happening in this context here. And, there's dozens of other photos in the project which show, the frontline positions, which show the soldiers, the rebels, the militia groups, and what that side of the context actually looks like. Because again, just to reiterate, none of this happens in a vacuum. It's not a sort of a feel-good story where we're looking for, quotes. We need to see the action. So this is a picture taken in a town called Beni, North Kivu. So Beni is currently a very red conflict zone. There's a rebel group called the ADF there who have pledged allegiance to Islamic State jihadist ideology there. So that's an example of a rebel group where negotiations, dialogue, and conversation with the combatants is absolutely impossible due to the ideology of these groups. Any sort of attempt at communicating or interacting with these groups would be far too dangerous for civilians. So this is an instance of women just doing what they can to protect their communities. So soldiers are deployed from all over the Congo into East Congo to fight rebel groups. But these soldiers are often underfunded, have no rations, barely any equipment, and are strangers to the provinces where they've been posted. So the military will begin to steal, harass, and intimidate the local population. And this can often lead to extra conflicts. Sexual violence is common, perpetrated by soldiers against local women. It's a pretty tricky context. So in this photograph, we're with a group of peace activists who had gone to start a dialogue event with a group of soldiers and also the families of the soldiers stationed at this base, because the soldiers had been accused of theft, of stealing land from the locals. And this is, just a sort of a small example of how peace is a lot more complicated to photograph than the conflict. It's not something that's dramatic, and it's not something that's as visual as tanks, soldiers, helicopters, etc., etc. It's a million small things that add up to a greater whole, most of which the impacts can be pretty invisible because you only notice when conflict breaks out. So this is an example of some of the smaller acts we went to witness, dialogue, creating communication between people to stop small conflicts and small grievances spilling out into larger rivalries, which can turn bloody very quickly in Congo. So again, so I haven't picked some of my sort of most flashy photographs for this because, again, the subject is peace. So what we have here is a group of lawyers in a town called Butembo. So it's an association of women lawyers in this town and their supporting staff. And what they do, amongst other things, amongst their sort of day jobs, is they also take on the cost of having rape cases brought to trial for local women who have been raped, because, you know, it's only it's less than $50, but, you know, you're in some of the most poor regions of Africa here. You know, people are scraping by on subsistence farming. They have no money. You know, they're in very vulnerable communities where sexual violence is common. And if rape is reported, it's very unlikely for most women that case will get its day in court. So that's the first part of what they do. And the second part is, I don't know if you can see, but these guys they're submitting their dossiers to are actually soldiers. So North Kivu in East Congo is under military rule. So that means quite a lot of the court system has been defaulted to be under the control of the military. And if we follow this thread, what you look at in the statistics is you see that most instances of sexual violence and rape perpetrated in East Congo are statistically more likely to be members of the state forces, police, military, migration officials, etc., because they're in this position of power. They're armed. They are often underfunded themselves, sort of quite, you know, cavalier attitude to their positions and jobs. So you have a position where witnesses or victims in trials are going through the court system, most likely, you know, with, you know, colleagues or acquaintances or, you know, people in the same units as their attackers. So these women also keep witnesses safe. Witnesses are supposed to be guaranteed anonymity and things like this. And again, this is just, you know, a real demonstrate, you know, like, photographing piece is a really sort of unshowy affair. It's turning up to work, you know, 5 days a week, 12 months a year, exhausting, pushing for advocacy for very vulnerable civilians that no one else is. And yeah, and these ladies do a fantastic job. This is also in a zone which is seeing a lot of massacres at the moment. We're in an area here where women are often kept as wives, as the terminology is, by rebel groups. You know, they're kidnapped and kept in the bush. So all of these resources and stuff, you know, it's part of peace building as well. This is stuff that the state is not doing for women abandoned in these conflict zones. So I hope with those 4 pictures, we kind of get a sense of what we were trying to achieve. You know, the moments where civilians are able to interact with soldiers and influence the discussion in a positive way, the severity and the proximity of the conflict, and then, you know, the hundreds of small little heroic acts by activists within that context. Because also, you know, people can face really serious consequences for speaking up, putting their head above the parapet, as it were, being a voice for peace. It does make you a target. You know, we've spoken to several activists who, you know, they've given up, they drop out. You know, they're tired of being threatened. At the moment, you're in a very sensitive political context with the government, who is, you know, rearming militia groups to fight M23 rebels. So at the same time, peace activists most feel unable to speak out about certain things, and you have to, people pick their moments, and they're very careful about when they step up to advocate for civilians, because you can face serious consequences, arrest, intimidation, or assault. So anyway, I'll hand back to Camille if she has any final words to add. And yes, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
We're hearing about the next stories.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I have to say, you know, that work, Camille, is inspiring. It is. It's very difficult not to be moved by the quality of the story, but also the quality of the journalism, and the juxtaposition of scenes of war and devastation against the sheer humanity in the actions of women trying to find a way towards the difficult way towards peace and reconciliation, but also, most importantly, the demand for justice and for justice to be served. I think one of the interesting questions that was emerged from that was the point is that women are not just at risk in conflict zone from combatants from a so-called other side. That actually women are at risk from everybody in a conflict zone, and that it would be wrong to sort of think that it's only an opposing side which actually provides a threat. It's such an important story. My question to you is this the sort of story that can be easily, you can easily find an audience in mainstream media? how was it in terms of getting the story told and picked up, and did it generate even more interest?
Do you want to do this one?
I'll do that one if you don't mind. Yeah. So as in terms of getting stories like this funded for freelancers, this project was actually funded by an American organization called the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. And that is a fantastic resource because publications often are, unwilling or, a bit like trying to save, I mean, the industry is a complete state. And editors are often sort of unwilling to actually really put their budgets on the line for long-term reporting. So the Pulitzer Center is a vital resource for when outlets who should be funding this kind of work don't fund this kind of work. So that enabled us to have lots of time on the ground because it is incredibly expensive, this kind of reporting. To get to these locations, you're needing flights out into the bush. You're needing, some areas, to hire 4x4s, adds up very, very quickly. This kind of work, and also paying people properly, because we're, our team, including our Congolese colleague, we're moving to other areas where we're not based. So we're hiring other local journalists there who are also contributing, small bits of translation for local languages. For instance, some of this project, none of these pictures we've seen are from Ituri province, but in Ituri province, civilians speak a whole other language, which none of us speak, including Sifa. They don't speak Swahili, they speak Kilendo. So you need to hire a translator there. It is really resource intensive. So it's very, very tricky to actually get big projects funded these days. I mean, I've found that at least. And that's also why stuff like award funding is also phenomenal. For instance, this has been awarded by Sony, the Fetisov Journalism Awards, and now my photos have been awarded by the Red Cross. These kind of awards are phenomenal for giving you, some spare cash to put back into, because at this stage, I think it's fair to say, at least from my perspective, most long-term journalism is a passion project. No one is doing this to get rich. People are doing this because they think these stories are important and still deserve to be heard. And outside of some of the huge sort of like papers, like New York Times Magazine or something, I personally find it incredibly difficult to get this stuff funded.
Right.
But risk pays off. If you push through it, we've found that, it's always your projects that you've absolutely fought tooth and nail for that really zing with audiences. We've had several exhibitions of this work. People have been really interested to discuss it. We've had exhibitions in London, Scotland, and we've had, thousands and thousands of extra eyes.
I mean, I think,
so that's an example of like getting it out there.
Thanks very much indeed. I mean, I think it's inspiring work. It seems to me that really it indicates something that's very, very important, that if freelancers and teams of journalists are trying to get stories like this told, they do have to go and look for funding from very often foundations and donors, as you have done, and that is possible. So it's very important, I think, that we spread the network news about what potential sources there are. And it's a tragedy that in modern journalism, the crisis inside modern media is such that this sort of journalism is not automatically being funded and resourced. So I accept what you say, absolutely. Look, we'll come back to you later on. We've got some commentary, and I want to just say congratulations again, and thank you very much indeed. It was absolutely super to hear from you.
Thanks, guys.
I wonder now if I can go on to our second story that we're going to deal with, and it's in a different part of the world, but it's actually a part of the world which over the past decades has actually been a center of a great deal of conflict, and which, although the bullets have stopped flying mostly, there's still conflict on the ground. So, and that's in the Western Balkans, and Nidžara Ahmetašević, who was a winner last year of the Fetisov Journalism Award, and herself is absolutely renowned and distinguished journalist and activist and campaigner on these issues. I'm really pleased to say has joined us to tell us about her story and what she was able to do. And Nidžara, I remember remember very well at the presentation of the award that everyone was very moved by the story, that it touched their hearts, but also it actually responded and resonated with people who believe that this sort of journalism really needs to be told because it can make a real difference to people's lives. So please tell us about the story.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Thank you for all these compliments, and thank you for organizing this. This is a very important topic, I mean, at all time, especially now when we are witnessing another wars around the world and when we are seeing again how women voices are put aside. For me, this story that was published for one small publication actually in Kosovo, but it has a regional coverage. Luckily, I published it in English, so immediately the audience became much bigger. It's a kind of like a story that I was working on for extremely long period of time. It took me almost 20 years to really write this story. I started following and kind of like observing the role of women and how women are talking in different way about war in the middle of the war that I survived to in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I noticed immediately that the way how women speak about the war is much, much different than what men are doing. Unlike the men talk about the war, even in the media or by politicians, that was highly militarized, full of propaganda, full of hate. These voices that I heard from women were always voices about the peace and voices that were demanding change and showing us what the war really is. In that sense, I started following the stories of women from the war, but my real first contacts with the survivors, with women who survived wartime rape or women of Srebrenica are those after the war. So in a way, I started writing this story or collecting information for this story in 1997, which is a very long period of time. But all this time, I was learning and observing and seeing how this peace talk develops and how this women activism that in Bosnia and Herzegovina developed. And what I understood, and I'm happy that I kind of like was coming back to this story because it gave me a different perspectives on everything. And at the end, I understood that what is a big difference between how women approach to talk about the war, to activism against the war and against the militarism is something that I find these words in words by Professor Avishai Margalit from Israel, professor, who writes about a decent society. Even though I find it as a minimum, for me is exactly what I see that these women in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I can say also in many other countries, including Palestine and conflict that's going on at the moment are fighting for is a decent society. And that's exactly what my story is about. I wrote about the movement of women of Srebrenica, who are for me real examples of feminism, of radical feminism, I have to say, who are fighting for something very simple and something very basic, and that is a decent society or civilized society, one where people respect each other. And that's kind of like a basic, and that's the lesson that one of the lessons that I learned through following the work of this movement of women from Srebrenica. What is very important for me and for this story is to say that women became active and in peace promotion, women of Srebrenica, even during the siege of Srebrenica, that was one of the worst in Europe or in modern history when it comes to war, and that ended up with a genocide. This picture that you can see here is made by women in Srebrenica who is one of initiators of the movement of women of Srebrenica, even in 1993, when the UN soldiers entered the city that was already under the siege. What women organized is that they blocked the UN convoy, not allowing them to leave Srebrenica unless they do something to help to people who were dying, starving. And this is very important, and this picture is very important. And unfortunately, last year, a woman who made this picture, one of the activists, died. She was a witness at The Hague and in many other cases against those people who committed crimes in Srebrenica. And she contributed a lot to peace in this country and to feminism, not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but around the world. We learn from her and other women what the feminism is and how women should organize to fight for peace. These are some of the images about the activism of women that I write in this story about. These are women from Srebrenica, which are gathered in several self-organized groups and NGOs. What is really important that they don't give up. They started organizing immediately in 1996, so a couple of months after they left Srebrenica, and that's what I write about in my story. At that moment, the media in Bosnia and Herzegovina, population was very afraid, and media were reporting about the events in Srebrenica in a way that was full of nationalism, full of hate. But they didn't really tell us what is really happening. Women who survived the Golgotha of Srebrenica, they arrived to Tuzla and some small areas in eastern part of Bosnia, and they self-organized immediately, demanding that somebody do something and to help them to find their relatives who stayed in Srebrenica, and to tell the world what is really happening in Srebrenica at that moment, because we were still not very sure about the scale of atrocities that were committed in these small cities. They, until today, every 11th of month in this city of Tuzla, where this gathering started and when this movement was initiated, women still come out on the street and remind us, when I say us, I think everybody who sees them, about what had happened in Srebrenica, but also sending a message about the peace. What is very important that throughout the years, the women of Srebrenica, they never gave up on the fighting for the peace. They engaged in promotion of the work of the war tribunal. They engaged in helping to the prosecution to find people who will testify about what did happen in Srebrenica. And also they kind of like were very active, insisting that memorial center dedicated to all the victims of Srebrenica is placed in the same place where the biggest part of the massacres happen, in Potocari, where it is today. They are insisting that every year politicians are in Srebrenica, which I find quite controversial, but then some of them explains to me that they are not inviting politicians, including, as you can see here, this is a president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, very controversial person. They are not inviting them there in order to have politicians and to hear politicians what they want to tell to them, but they want them because they see that their presence is acknowledgement of the massacres and crimes that were committed in Srebrenica, but also they want them to be there in Srebrenica to tell them what they want to tell, so that their voice is the voice that leads, that gives the picture, that is the lead voice. I am following, for the first time, I went with women of Srebrenica to Srebrenica in 2000, or maybe even earlier, when for the first big burial that is organized there. And it was very moving for me because I was in a bus with them. I didn't want to travel with other journalists in a separated car and just to observe, but I wanted to be part of that. And for me, it was moving going back to Srebrenica, passing the same way that they were taking out from Srebrenica, and the stories that they were telling, but also the way how they engaged, not only with me, but with everybody else around them, being very patient and kind of like suppressing their emotions, knowing how important it is to tell the truth and how important it is to be political while you're telling this truth. And that is also feminism. The results, some of the results of their efforts, but also of like what many of us as a journalist wrote, are seen in decisions, different decisions by international criminal courts around the world, but also in a recently adopted resolution on Srebrenica, where they do acknowledge the role of women of Srebrenica. However, what I find very problematic for this resolution, but also in general, the way how these women who are like really fierce fighters, is the way that they are until today, and that is exactly what I'm writing about, they keep calling them mothers of Srebrenica. And in that way, they very often ignore this radical feminism and this self-organizing way and this peace promotion and this role that they put on themselves. And I really think that what they have done and how they act and what they are doing until today is how feminism should be, and is a big lesson for feminists all around the world. But women of Srebrenica are not the only one. There are other women in Bosnia that were focused on different stories I wrote over the years, including women who survived rape during the war. Yesterday was International Day Against the Wartime Rape. And the women from Bosnia and Herzegovina marked even that day, inviting more women to come out to talk about what did happen. What they achieved also is very, very important, because they literally changed the international law, recognizing wartime rape as a weapon of war, which is also a very important feminist struggle. At the end, before I finish, I always kind of like, when I talk about this issue, when I talk about feminists and their struggle in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and these women who are like insisting on peace and who are like trying to find a way to speak about everything that happened, but also to call people not to go to another war, not only in Bosnia, but they are going and talking against the war everywhere around the world, is this very simple image. This is image from Foča, one of the cities where mass rape was committed on a huge scale. Until today, these atrocities are not really recognized at the level that it should be. They are not even recognized as genocide. But women every year go to this city to mark. Even yesterday, they went there to kind of remember all the women who died during the war as victims of torture, have been killed, and women who were raped. And this is a hand of a woman who, with the lipstick, is writing the word genocide on this small monument that they built there. At the end, one of the very important lessons that I learned from these women, and that I as a journalist think is important, and that I'm trying in my work to kind of like repeat, and that is very important today, when the genocide is happening again in different countries around the world, is that we cannot afford ourselves not to talk about the war, not to talk about war crimes, and to be quiet when we are witnessing something like that. And that we also have to fight for peace. We have to fight for freedom and for justice. And that's exactly what these women are doing. They're fighting for decent society. And I think we should join them in that. And with my work, I'm trying to do that for more than 2 decades now. Thank you.
Nidžara, thank you very much indeed. I have to say, the journalism involved is inspiring, as well as the story itself. And I think the work that you've done is absolutely tremendous. The problem here about the way that women in the heart of these conflicts are very often unrecognized, of course, but actually not even encouraged or invited to participate in the peacemaking processes and so on. I noticed, for example, that in the European Union facilitated dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina 2 years ago, there were no women who participated at all in that process. And once we've heard the story that you have told, you know, it beggars belief that the notion of peace can be negotiated without actually having at the table all of the important voices that need to be heard. And I think that sort of the journalism that you've revealed here is really extremely useful and helpful. I mean, what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite your a colleague from the Balkans, and my good friend Ljiljana Zurovac, who's the member of the expert committee of the Fetisov Journalism Awards. And we've worked together many years, Ljiljana, on this issue about media coverage and so on. And the question about why media are not giving more attention, paying more attention to the discrepancy in institutional work built towards building peace. And that discrepancy is about the failure to recognize the value of women at the peace table and so on. So, I mean, what are your reflections on what Nidžara has had to say?
Yeah, I was listening this really with great excitement, considering that I am following Nidžara's work from her very beginning in journalism. And I think it is really amazing. Not this very story about Srebrenica's women, but about many other things, what she done. It is excellent. First of all, not to recognize Srebrenica's women as mothers, as only mothers, but as a women who try to do some different things and to build peace, no matter what was happened in their very tragic lives, actually. I'm very much proud on our Fetisov Journalism Award work, considering that we inspired journalists and give them boost to go to there, to say and to publish things what couldn't be published maybe without Fetisov Journalism Award. So Nidžara, go forward. I'm looking forward to more similar articles and more similar investigative work, what you are going to do.
Thank you very much. I mean, did you have anything to add yourself on the theme and in your work with the Bosnian Press Council, for example? You were very, very much a person in the front line of looking at how media were responding to the challenges of reporting the conflict and so on. And you were very, very much able to sort of see the quality of that media response. What were your sort of reflections on how, on the question of the visibility of women in the conflict and their contribution to building the peace?
It is very poor, actually. It is really poor, and I'm very sad that I must to admit that there are less and less good investigative articles in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Serbia, in Macedonia, all around our Western Balkans region, and less talks about women and their great role in as a persons who make peace and who hold peace. There are so many excellent associations, NGOs, and women who do great things, but they are not visible. They are not visible just because some or most of the editors think that this is not interesting to the public, but it is. Positive stories are interesting for the public, but there is no place for them in the mainstream media or in private media. One of the reasons is that many of the private media are very much connected to the current politics, and editors are it is not exaggerate to say obey media owners, and they are not independent. They will not say, no, this story deserves to be in our edition. So run for clicks, run for sensationalism, run for hate speech also prevail, and this is sad. This is sad, but I have hope for new generation of good professional journalists who will open their own blogs, who will open their own online media, and will put such kind of stories in their platforms. I think this is the hope.
Thank you very much indeed for that. That's really very useful. Before we move on, Camille, I think you had a question that you wanted to put to Nidžara after her presentation. Do you want to do that now?
Thank you. No, not really a question, but something that stood out for me because it sounded quite similar to what we've observed. Couple of points, actually. Both Nidžara and Ljiljana, you mentioned this kind of, framing of women as mothers, and the fact that they're kind of confined in that box and that space. And it's harder for them to be viewed as, you said, activists, radical organizers. And for us in Congo, we also saw that, all the women who are like telling us, it's very hard being a woman activist because of patriarchy, because you get people telling you, go back to your children. What are you doing? You should be cooking for your husband. How dare you step out of these roles? Go and be a mother. But on the other hand, unanimously, they all also said their main identity as activists and their main motivation was as mothers. So when we asked them, why are you doing this and taking all these risks? They're like, because we're mothers. And, with Congo's been in a conflict for, 30, 40 years. And we need to build a better future for our children. And all of they frame it as because we do it because we're mothers. So there's not so much kind of clash between these two identities. Somehow they reconcile it, and I found it really, really interesting. And you also said, Nidžara, like they don't give up, and you said you've been documenting this for 20 years now. And it reminded me of one of the activists, Chusine Masika, whom we spoke to. She was one of the very first women to really stand out for peace in the 1990s. And we have this quote from her where she says, basically, we women, we've been fighting for peace for 30 years. We've been doing sittings. We're flying to Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Kinshasa, New York. We attend these conferences, these peace negotiations, everything. And now we have gray hair and the situation just keeps getting worse. And, you can feel that they have this really strong sense of hopelessness and like despair, but because of their identity as mothers, they also can't give up. And they also, very strongly told us, like, this is why, even when, we have gray hair and we're tired, we also train these new generations. And some of the women, I think in the National Geographic article, we have this fantastic young girl who's, I think, 19, who, is also becoming part of this movement and building this new generation. So I just wanted to just draw the similarities, because what you said about mothers really resonated with the work we've been doing here. But thank you so much for an amazing presentation.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think I agree. It's absolutely super. And it's interesting from what you say, Camille, and what Nidžara has said, that the issues, the problems, the challenges are universal. They're not just one region. There's not just one part of one conflict in one special part of the world. There is a sort of universal set of challenges and problems here that need to be addressed. And Raffaella, I mean, I think I'd like to bring you in now to have your sort of comments on this. Raffaella, you're a warrior for important good causes. You've been fighting issues on human rights, against anti-apartheid, for years, and then dealing with issues related to peace negotiations. You've been an international observer. You've worked in the Middle East and Africa in particular, and of course in Russia. And being a freelance journalist, so you've seen a lot of what we've talked about and heard so far. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts about the challenges that are facing journalists who are trying to get these stories told against a range of obstacles, and how do they overcome them, and how do they move forward with it? Please.
First of all, I'm not a warrior. I am
a warrior for peace.
Yeah, it's a contradiction word. We have to find another term for the future. I don't know which one, but for sure something that is not connected to war. But I know what you mean, of course. Yeah, I was hearing, and Nidžara was really fantastic and touched many things that I feel very, very deeply. And I really know that it is not an easy issue to approach this combination, let's say, between the role of feminists and feminist activists and women in general, activists at grassroots level, especially at grassroots level, in the areas of conflict, because this combination with the women that are writing or working in media as a radio journalist or TV journalist or any other way of journalism is something that is, I think, very connected to the representation of what is the role of, not a role of women as such, but in general to represent a conflict and the war. Because what I mean that, for example, what I see concerning European media, and in particular the Italian ones, concerning Ukraine war, the representation of what is Russia and what is Ukraine and how is going on the war, is something that usually is separated in two parts. The media who represents and support the hate, as it was just said before, so somehow supporting the creation of a conflict or supporting a conflict and supporting an escalation of the war as such. And there is also another kind of journalism that wants to represent the chances for any kind of dialogue that can be developed and can be spread. And this second one is quite very, very limited if we look to the Italian media, at least. So I cannot speak about particularly about others, but the Italian one for sure are usually acting in describing Russia, for example, as only one entity with its leader, and that's it. There is no representation of any other voice that actually are concretely representing the country as well. And of course, I mean about the people who is not in favor of this war and aggression. The same is happening concerning other conflicts, of course, and this is something that, for example, is is very connected to, which is the representation of some activities or some events or some acts that are developed in this time. For example, if I can take an example, is the women who are once and claim in Russia or other contexts claim that their men come back from the front. And this is represented from the majority of newspapers as something that is actually nothing political. This is just, you know, people, just women that wants that their husband come back, and that's it. But there is a description of this kind of acts that cannot be reduced to this I use these words thinking that you understand what I mean, but not underlining the political content of this kind of.
What I'd like to do, if I can, is to ask Nidžara to maybe to reply to what Camille said earlier, and if you could deal with that, and then we'll come back to Raffaella when she's here. Nidžara.
Thank you. And Camille, thank you very much for your support and kind words. I really appreciate it, especially because I see your work, and that's amazing. Yes, you are right. Very often, even women from Srebrenica will identify themselves as mothers in the first place. But that is a result of living in a highly patriarchal societies, which is in Congo, which is in Bosnia, but which is in a big part of the world. I have to say, in the highly patriarchal society, women is visible only if she is a mother. And only if she is a mother, she has a right to have a voice, and her voice will be heard, but only as a mother. But you know that for decades, and I'm 100% sure from your work that you know that being a feminist, being openly feminist, and demanding what feminists are demanding, and that's like a society that is not highly militarized, that is society where peace and justice rule, is still seen as a problem. And they're just pushed aside. If these women in Congo, but also in Bosnia or anywhere else who are doing the same thing, come out and say we are radical feminists, they will be pushed aside. Their voices will not be heard at all. But, you know, their actions are showing, I mean, and that's very interesting. Like some of women from Srebrenica, they are working together, and they are like part of this. I'm not sure if you know about Women in Black. That's an international radical feminist movement. And it's different way how they talk, but they are less heard than those who are identified by the public only as mothers. Because, but what is the problem also when they're identified only as mothers? Mothers will not be invited to a peace negotiation because mother is too emotional. And that's exactly how women are very often dismissed in societies, and especially in patriarchal society. We are told that you are too emotional for anything. Like being emotional is wrong. And then even any argument that you will offer, like even like highly educated, even with full arguments or whatever, are just dismissed because they will just, oh, it's a woman, she's emotional, and it's a mother, you know, I mean, mother is looking for her son, and that's it. I mean, why should we invite her for the negotiation table? And at the end, you have a Dayton peace agreement like we have in Bosnia, which is not a peace. And that's a highly problematic. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Raffaella, you're back. Thank goodness for that. We just had very quickly a question that Camille put, and you heard the response from Nidžara, and I saw you nodding furiously about it. So I think you probably agree with the sentiments expressed. So would you like to continue?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but my computer was disconnected. I don't know why, but my phone is working. So, just to I agree with Nidžara. I exactly, this is what usually is expelled from the mediation processes. Women as something that is too sensitive, too emotional, but it is exactly what is we feel it's the reason why we are in conflicts and we have faced conflicts and wars, because humanity is expelled from the tables where should sit and should have the voice. But let's go back to the resolution 1325. It's a resolution that, as you know, has been obtained by after years of fight to obtain this kind of resolution to recognize the role of women in peace processes. But it was something that it was claimed for many years and was approved. The question is now that this resolution as such is nothing if there is not a recognition by the institutions who should give the space and represent and recognize the role of women around the important table of negotiations. And this is something that, for example, there is a newspaper, actually the one with which I am working in this moment, that is developing a campaign claiming the European Parliament, the new one that is just established, was elected, to take in consideration the resolution and do what is needed in order to support this kind of resolution, not to be just something that is on paper, but something that can be concretely support and give the role to women to express their voice and their role, which is absolutely concrete. It's not something that is on the moon, let's say. And is always the same. I was saying before about the question of how the things are represented, how the conflicts are represented. It can be the hate from one side, so representing the enemy, let's say, the so-called enemy, as something compact, you know, with the representation of all the reality of a country as an enemy, and without giving all the intermediate colors that are there. So who is representing the so-called third way is excluded. And as a Christa Wolf was writing in Cassandra, and this is the end of my comment, she said, between killing and dying, there is a third way, which is leave. And this is and this is something that we have to take in consideration, and especially for the women who works in media, is something that they sometimes have to fight for, trying to resist from the idea of a censorship to their way to represent the war and the conflicts, and giving voice and space to different voices that are representing societies and conflicts contexts with their different colors, not just the white and the black, but all the gray that is in the middle. I don't know if this is something useful.
Thank you very much indeed, Raffaella. I think you've touched on really such an important issue which arises from both of the presentations that we've had, which is actually how we translate the wishful thinking of the United Nations, for example, into concrete action to be able to ensure that women are at the peace table, that it's taken seriously, and so on. Some progress has been made. I mean, for example, I know that in the conflict in Colombia, for example, there were both delegations from the government and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, were actually, they had parity in terms of representation of women and men, and participating as negotiators and delegations. But you have to compare that with the reality of the conflict in Ethiopia or the conflict in Yemen, and a reference I made earlier to the continued continued talks sponsored by the European Union between Belgrade and Pristina in the Western Balkans. There is still, you know, some basic progress to be made. And the problem remains is that it's still not on the news agenda of news media. And that remains an incredible problem. We heard earlier from Hugh about the need for freelancers in particular, but actually it's not just freelancers. Some media, some major media themselves go to third parties, foundations and donors for support in order to be able to support journalism in various parts of the world. And so we see this massive problem about finding the resources that will help journalists be able to tell these stories. And then they have to come up against the obstacles of deeply embedded prejudices in patriarchal sort of organizations which push back against these stories being told. Ahmetašević, you from the Fetisov Journalism Award, all of this is familiar to you. You have been working on this issue for so many years. So give us your thoughts about, you know, what can be done and what are the sort of key challenges that journalists and news media face in being able to ensure that there is visibility for women in the peace process and in post-conflict actions.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to congratulate us all with this fantastic discussion. I think it's one of the best and the most significant webinars we had. And it shows that we are going on and touching the most important points in our profession and the media environment and in our global agenda as a whole. First of all, I should tell that I'm deeply impressed with this fantastic discussion and its celebration of brilliant journalism, which is the main goal of Fetisov Journalist Awards. So it's not, the main idea is not just to give awards, to give prizes to brave and talented and gifted and great journalists, but to support journalism as a public good, to highlight the most important points and to support journalism as a very important part of contemporary life. What we see in 5 years, that journalism is still alive, despite all ideas that journalism should be put to museum, that information space should be ruled and controlled by media managers and filled with cheap and ready for everything quick information workers and so on and so forth. What we see, what we face in our awards, it's real strong journalism which is going on. Second, what is personal is very important for me. It's understanding and digging in women's participation in general development of our world and in conflict resolution. I do remember thinking about this issue. I can't forget fourth global conference on women supported and arranged by UN. United Nations, 1995 in Beijing. I do remember that it was the first moment in history when women journalists got a voice, when issues like violence during conflicts have been discussed a lot. And I do remember that it was a time when women journalists covering West Balkan crisis and especially and other conflicts made a difference, and violence and mass rape during wartime was understood as a crime against humanity. So it was for the first time, it was thanks to women journalists coming to conflict zones, first of all to former Yugoslavia, and journalists from the region. I do remember how difficult it was. I was working in International Women's Journalist Organization and in mainstream newspaper, political newspaper in Russia at that time. I do remember how for me and for my colleagues was difficult to push, to publish any article about women's issues, about gender equality and anything including domestic violence. In 30 years, we see some progress. I can't agree with the idea which was just presented here that we do not see any progress. We see that many media, big media and new media and startups, they pay attention to women. They pay attention to women's rights, and it's clear for everybody now that without gender equality, without women's participation, we cannot think, we cannot talk about any progress in any field of our life. And what about conflicts? I do remember, because I was covering and I was participating in many UN initiatives about gender equality, Beijing Plus and Millennium Development Goals and so on and so forth. 1325 resolution has been discussed for decades. Some progress, yes, some progress, no. But role of the media was crucial here. And it was discussed now that it should be more presented in different media. It should be much more discussed. And role of women journalists, we started our meeting now with a short comment of Aidan that we have no gender balance here. Most female journalists are here. That's right. First of all, journalism is becoming a female-dominated profession everywhere, including patriarchal societies. Second, women are more sensitive to issues associated with suffering and violence, not only against women. And it's not a surprise that women write the most interesting and touching and deep articles and reports about women during the conflict. Nidžara said very important point that women are presented usually as victims and mothers everywhere. But women as activists could and should and will play serious role in the future. And it's depend on us. It's depend on journalists and women journalists, first of all. I would like to remind you about some initiatives devoted to women as peacemakers and peace communicators. 15 years ago, UNESCO started a very interesting project devoted to women journalists covering conflicts and their role in peace communication. We had very serious gathering of women from the States, from Asia, from Eastern and Western Europe, from Central Asia, from different conflict zones. Most of them, I do remember Raffaella took part in this conference. It was very special event, very successful. Unfortunately, UNESCO had no enough money to go on with this project. But what we figured out, we understood that without any idea about each other, those women journalists covering conflicts first stayed longer than traditional teams of journalists. Second, staying in the conflict zone, if they were women from other countries, they followed peacemaking process and they described it and they wrote, covered it. And second, women from the ground and women from international teams, they worked on peace communication, which is crucial during post-conflict reconciliation and post-conflict development. I do think that it probably could be discussed in the future. And I'm very happy that Fetisov Journalism Award had special attention to the issue of women's rights. And now we have, I don't remember what percentage, but very serious number of articles devoted to women's rights, mostly to violation of women's rights. I think we could develop this discussion. I think we could probably in the future think about some special gathering together with some partners, United Nations agencies or some IPI or other agencies, because it is very important to discuss. It is very important to support. And what Raffaella mentioned, that role of journalism is also should be discussed, because yes, we know that sometimes journalism, bright journalism, unfortunately, promote escalation, promote something which do not help to resolve not only conflicts, but a language of aggression. And a point of peace journalism is well discussed by academic people, by professionals. So we have several options for the future. And I'm very happy that we probably could go on with sharing best practices, with showing examples and approaches of journalists to this very important and serious point. And I wish all the best to our fantastic winners, to all our participants. And I'm sure that this webinar would be used by academic courses, by training sessions, by all professionals who are interested in work in this field. And I hope we'll repeat similar webinar or meeting in probably hybrid form in some time. Thank you very much and good luck. And congratulations again. It was, you know, it was very touching. It was great. And it shows that we are on the right way. Thank you.
Nadia, thank you very much indeed. As usual, inspiring and optimistic, and I'm really happy about that. I think I agree with you very much. We've had a really interesting session. I was just wondering very quickly before we wind up, is there anyone who would like to add anything at this stage or to ask a final question or a final thought? If not, I must say I do want to thank everybody and join Nadia in thanking all of the participants. You know, it has been it's so interesting to hear from you. Camille and Hugh, what you've been doing in the Congo is just absolutely extraordinary, exemplary journalism. I mean, really tremendous. Nidžara, I mean, I think you touched on issues which resonate in all sorts of areas, and it's great. And I'm so grateful for Ljiljana and Raffaella for you know, for their very thoughtful comments as well, which has really helped us better understand the issues and so on. And I think, and I accept this very much, about the need for us to discuss this in a vocabulary and a language which is not actually defined by conflict itself. And I think that is really very important and very useful. We will, I hope, Nadia, return to this issue. It's impossible to avoid, and we would never avoid it anyway. And I hope that maybe as we see the development of the Fetisov Journalism Awards, we will see this particular issue, gender equality, the voice of women being heard, the role that they play inside journalism, but also in the struggle within society, you know, for a better world for everyone. And I think that that is absolutely right. I should say before we wrap up that this is a great start to our latest program of seminars, of webinars, and they are seminars as well. I mean, and I think it is really very, very useful, because I think for news media and journalists, I think there is a lot of experience here which can be built upon and which can be developed. And it gives great hope for the future of journalism. And I agree with Nadia. I think journalism is in good health, despite the structural problems and despite the political pressures and despite the corporate pressures that are in play. The fact of the matter is, there is no future for democracy and human rights without free and independent journalism. And I think that's absolutely clear. So the more that we're supporting that, the better. This webinar is the first. We are going to be having a second in the series in September, in which we're going to look at the question of the way that media approach the role of young people and children and their reporting in this sort of critical area, particularly around one of the mainstream issues on the news agenda these days, which is the question of migration. So we're going to have a sort of specific look at that. And the question of the role of children in conflict zones. I don't have to mention to you the terrible tragedy of child soldiers, the terrible tragedies in Africa of schoolgirls being kidnapped in Nigeria and becoming pawns in a regional conflict and so on. So the question of how media reporting children will be really very important, and we'll do that in September. Later on in November, we're going to have another one, which is going to be on the question of holding power to account. Political and corporate centers of power. We live in a world where these powers are ever more abusive of people's fundamental rights and civil liberties. So we're going to look at how the journalism is covering that. And early next year in January, we're going to have a look at environmental journalism and the importance of environmental journalism and how it's becoming even more risky than it has been in recent years. So this is going to be a very important area. In all of this, we will be using as the basis for our discussion the high quality winners of the Fetisov Journalism Awards. So this will be a way of us promoting stories that have been told and need to be told again in order to help us sort of develop the awards for the future. Finally, I should say to you that time moves on. And, you know, we've had a thought about some of our greatest hits from this year and the previous year. We are now opening and looking for entries for this year's Fetisov Journalism Awards. So please use your networks to encourage people to apply, and they can get all of the information that they need on our website. And so please do what you can to spread the word. We are going to make this a regular event. These webinars are going to become very much an instrument for promoting journalism at its best. Congratulations again, and thank you for those of you who have shown just what is meant by that notion of journalism at its best. It's always in the public interest. It's always going to be a better world if we have really good, substantial, ethical and independent journalism. Thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for joining us. And really, I look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very
Thanks.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Good luck.